So last time I reviewed this show, I said that one of its biggest problems was that it just seemed like it was trying to be Hamilton. Now it feels like it's trying to be Hamilton mixed with Les Mis. Oh my god, hey, welcome back to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. My name is MickeyJo and I am obsessed with all things theatre. And I'm also a professional theatre critic making video reviews on social media. This is my theatre-themed YouTube channel where I review the productions I have been invited to go and see. And today, I put my program too far away, oh no. Today we are going to be talking all about the musical Treason, which I recently saw at the Alexandra Palace Theatre in North London as part of an extensive tour that it is doing, during which there is also a scheduled performance at the prestigious London Palladium. Now, Treason is a relatively new musical based around the gunpowder plot and those who conspired to commit this act of treason against the then anti-Catholic legislation within the government. Amongst common knowledge, this is most often attributed to Guy Fawkes, whose likeness you see created in the flame here, and according to the musical, that is not necessarily the case. Now, this show first came to prominence when its sort of concept album and early recordings grew very popular online. And last year it was performed in concert over the summer at Theatre Royal Drury Lane. But it wasn't until this tour that we finally got a fully staged version of the show. And let me tell you, there have been many changes from the version last summer. When I saw that concert back in August of last year, I made a video review then saying that this was certainly not the British Hamilton, and that there was a lot of stuff that they needed to work on. So in today's video, we're going to talk about this updated version of the show. Have they worked on it? Have they made the changes that they needed to? And what is the show like now? All of that is to come in today's review video. If you enjoy this one, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel for many more reviews coming very soon about all of your favourite West End and Broadway shows. You can also find me on other social media platforms. I am at MickeyJoTheatre on Instagram, TikTok, and the app formerly known as Twitter. Finally, before I get into this review, if you have recently been to see Treason, let me know what you thought of it in the comments section down below. Was this your first experience of the show? Have you been a fan since you first heard the recording? Let me know all of your thoughts, because I am very interested to read them. In the meantime, here are mine. I'm going to do my best to walk you through my understanding of the plot, but as a general overview, it mixes a score by Ricky Allen with a new book by Charlie Eglinton, which I believe is new for this year, with Kieran Lynn, and additional lyrics and material credited to Deborah Stevenson, who I believe was much more involved with last year's mounting of the show. Now, last time around, I said that there were problems within the script and within the book, but that they were not limited to those sections of the show. We'll get to that later on. What the show used to consist of were these scenes depicting those who came together to create this gunpowder plot conspiracy and an explanation as to why they did it and their circumstances and romantic subplots that went some of the way towards explaining this. Also, we had the characters of the king at the time and those who existed around him, so we got a very full picture of kind of all of the players within this moment of history. But alongside these songs, these kind of epic and sweeping songs, we had little spoken poetic interludes, which didn't make all of that much sense. In the meantime, if you ask people in the UK who they associate with the gunpowder plot and with this story, it is going to be Guy Fawkes. Now, the show attempts to explain why that ought not to be the case. It kind of depicts him as this scapegoat who wasn't too heavily involved. And in the previous version of the show, he barely featured in it. He was just this one ensemble character. We only knew who he was because he was wearing an iconic hat. This time around, those poetic interludes remain, but Guy Fawkes is the person who delivers them, and we are seeing him from beyond the grave. The explanation to which is that the veil between this world and the next grows thinner around this time of year, ostensibly around the 5th of November, which is close to Halloween, I guess, so maybe that's why. I'm not about to sit here and try and work out this ghost logic. But Guy Fawkes, here he is, becomes our narrator, delivering these moments of critical poetry. Yeah, that's what I want to call them. It's very slam poetry-esque. He is joined by an ensemble of players who are dressed like they're in Hamilton, and they have a name within this which I must tell you because it fascinates me. I think they were called the Eyes. I feel like I read somewhere that they were the Eyes, like in Hunchback. The Eyes of Notre Dame. Anyway, Guy Fawkes doesn't so much narrate this as pops up in between different scenes and says something that we can infer from his tone and facial expression is like some sort of a withering commentary on what's going on. Unfortunately, it's also so deeply poetic and profound, I found it very difficult to infer what it was that he was actually talking about. But again, more on that later. The people who do end up being our protagonists and the perpetrators of this plot are a bunch of heavily persecuted Catholics. We have Thomas Percy, who has just married his wife Martha in secrecy because they're Catholic and they can't do that at that point. The story is unfolding in an immediately post-Elizabethan England in which Catholicism is very much out, what with the whole recent war with the Spanish and all. Not that the newly crowned King James really cares either way. He's pretty much a leaf in the breeze at this point, but he is also deeply paranoid and very susceptible to the advice of Robert Cecil, who himself is also very much anti-Catholic. We have some other Catholic characters. We have Robert Catesby, who is a very passionate instigator of all of this, who kind of ends up being the one who convinces everyone else to join him in his criminal conspiracy. We have Jack Wright, who I believe is Martha's brother, who she stops speaking to when he joins said criminal activity. We have Anne Vaux, who is also Catholic. That's really all I got there. Robert and Timothy, Catholic, also brothers. Now, the best way for me to describe to you what this show is like is to acknowledge its influences, because it has always been very heavily influenced by Hamilton, and it's not the only one. I'm not about to sit here and act as though this is the only show that is trying to duplicate the success that Hamilton has had. Basically, it is trying to be the British Hamilton. It is very transparent from the artwork, if nothing else, that that is what it's going for. And that has been clear from day zero. But like I said, not the only one. Sylvia, the suffragette musical, very clearly trying to be a Hamilton version of that story. Six is partially heavily inspired by Hamilton, but does a different enough thing and has a different enough sensibility that it just walks through a door that Hamilton opened rather than trying to stand in the door that Hamilton opened and make awkward conversation with Hamilton as if they're already friends when Hamilton doesn't know who you are. And it's not that it's wrong to be inspired by Hamilton. Hamilton changed the game in so many brilliant ways, and there's a lot of positive stuff you can take from Hamilton. The fact that all of the shows I just mentioned cast historical characters with a colourblind approach, I think is brilliant. The fact that we have diversity on stage in all of these shows is fantastic, and not just in tokenized roles. The fact that Martha Percy in the two productions of this I've seen has been cast with two different races. A bunch of other characters have as well. Where I start to see an unnecessary closeness to Hamilton is in the show's marketing, is in the feel of its choreography, is in the ensemble in these similar outfits picking up a chair and slowly turning it over their head and then dramatically placing it back down. But I do feel as though they really just have yet to find their own voice and their own perspective. While I'm in this section talking about the plot, this is one of my issues with this show, because the version of the story that they want to tell, they are doing a better job of it than they were doing last summer. They are beginning to work out what it is that they want to say with this story, but what it is that they want to say is not the most interesting story here. I don't think it is. We have this late stage revelation with Guy Fawkes' appearance and the idea of him becoming this scapegoat, but he's barely referenced by name throughout the entire thing. And inexplicably, we have no idea how he comes to be arrested or how he even comes to be involved. He is present as this poetic ghost the entire time, and he's like, no, I won't let this be my destiny. And he's trying to fight the inevitability of his situation, and then suddenly he is transported into the story. He finds himself there, he gets arrested with all these barrels of gunpowder around him. The gunpowder plot, if you didn't know, is successfully averted, and then he's burned at the stake. Spoilers, it happened a very long time ago, and primary school children sing about it all the time. Remember, remember, the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason plot. But without any explanation as to how that actually happened to him, we're barely telling that story. He just appears, and the whole thing is unexplained. The other issue that I have with this plot is us feeling this enormous sympathy for the plight of the Catholics during this time. And from what we hear in the dialogue, we come to understand that they are being unfairly persecuted and unjustly taxed. And there is a sequence in which we see violent atrocities committed against them. I feel like I need more at the beginning. You really need to walk me up to the idea of the Catholics being the most persecuted group, because otherwise I'm struggling to get on board with that notion. Think of your similar stories where we are seeing a group rising up against their oppressors. Think about Les Mis and the weight of the exposition to explain to you how dire these circumstances are. The number of times that we hear look down, the whole initial sequence with all of the prisoners, the look down reprise at the end of the day, all of these songs before we begin to introduce our characters to you specifically, just to lay the foundation of the oppression that is going on. That is what does not really happen successfully in Treason. The Prince of Egypt is another example I could give, a flawed show in many ways, but we have Deliver Us as this strong opening, and there are a bunch more musicals that I could give as examples here. But we don't really get that much of a sense until one terrible thing happens to these characters later on in the show, that their circumstances are so completely dire as to justify the actions they decide to take. But I'm beginning to blend into the next section, so let's talk about what I thought of this show and its material and this production. What was the star rating? Let's get into it. I'm gonna give it a 3-star review. Now, it's a low 3-star, and I've seen that a lot of other people have gone with a 2. For me, it did improve on so many fronts from that last version that I saw, and I feel like I need to acknowledge that improvement. It is moving in the right direction. I also think the whole Guy Fawkes thing that they're trying to fix in this version by including him more as the narrator really works. For what it's worth, he can just be the narrator and we don't need this afterlife coming through to this life explanation at the beginning. The one thing I liked with that character is that he has this watch the entire time that he's holding onto, and he throws it away because he's trying to reject his destiny, and then he gets handed a watch, and that's the representation that the inevitability of his death has caught up with him. That was a nice little direction detail, but otherwise I didn't find much originality in this direction, and I thought it was flawed in a lot of other places. And I am sorry to say this, because I am sure that there is so much passion and enthusiasm that has gone into putting this show together. But let me give you some examples of the areas where I have issues. One of them is the choreography by Taylor Walker. So it did feature a lot of this Hamilton style of choreography by the ensemble. There were 2 songs in a row right before the end of the first act where the Catholics were all plotting and conspiring and having a meeting together. For both of the numbers, for what felt like about 8 minutes on stage, you had the ensemble around them doing these like contemporary Hamilton-esque pieces of choreography. And it's just a long time to be holding a secretive meeting while people do elaborate choreography around the outside of you. And there's no sense of growth or development through that staging. It was just consistently a little bit unusual. All of the picking up of the furniture and slowly like carrying it over other people who would lean underneath it, it's all very Hamilton. And it doesn't really feel compatible with this particular story, because what Hamilton had was a contemporary sounding score. Hamilton's music is its most defining feature, right? It's modern R&B and rap. And this sounded a little bit more classic. It sounded a little bit Les Mis-esque at times. It sounded more traditional musical theatre. And so without a contemporary quality in the music and without a contemporary quality in the script, there wasn't much of a reason why the movement ought to be so modern looking. Something a little bit more timeless, something a little bit more classic might have been more appropriate. Hannah Chiswick is credited for direction and dramaturgy. And my issue with that inherently is I feel like they just need a separate dramaturg involved. This is a show that I think could really benefit from an additional perspective, because it strikes me as one of those things where the creative team, who all understand their shared vision for this material and the story that they are trying to tell, aren't able to really accurately gain a sense of how well they're telling that story and how unsuccessfully some of the storytelling is coming through. Because they know the characters' motivations. They understand why they're making the choices that they're making. That is able to inform their direction. That is able to inform their writing. But if they don't share that faithfully with the audience, then the audience can't join them on that journey, because we don't understand the weight of all of these choices. Now, the script has improved. I mentioned that there were various improvements from last year year's concert run. And there are. The script has definitely improved. We've lost a lot of what I think were unnecessary characters. I know I've seen comments from other people saying a lot of material that they enjoyed, a lot of songs have been cut and they were disappointed by that. I think it does feel generally tighter while still being a little bit longer than it needs to be. And there are some really strong songs still in there. This is what endeared people to this show originally. The song Take Things Into Our Own Hands, that's a great song. The Inevitable is another good song, but it lacks the context of the script around it to explain whatever she's wrestling with in that moment, because Nicole Raquel Dennis does a great job of acting through song there. You can tell that she is struggling under the weight of this big decision, but the script hasn't introduced that context to us well enough. Again, the creative team and the writers, everyone involved knows what's going through her mind, and Nicole knows what's going through her mind, but we're not in on it. At least not with any kind of depth or nuance, because we only come to find out what she did afterwards. We have this big revelation that comes after she's sung this song way later in the show. Beforehand, we just know that she's annoyed that her Catholic husband might be doing crimes without telling her. In fact, there's a great song that she sings with her husband, played by Sam Ferriday, as a duet. This is the one that has a little bit of a Disney quality to it, but this has no introduction from the script whatsoever. I believe they just walk on and sing this song together, and it's Thomas Percy singing about the faith that he has in Robert Catesby, and Martha's singing about the faith that she still has in her husband, even though both of them feel as though they ought to know better. On balance, I thought the score was generally very improved, and there were far fewer moments this time around where I thought this is not a great song. There were many more lyrical moments last year that I struggled with. There is still the occasional repetitious lyric that does labour the point a little bit, but largely it has been improved. Circling back to the script, I'm aware I started talking about that and then I went off on a musical tangent. Like I said, it's better, but there are issues that linger. It feels as though the script has arrived subsequently, which we know to be the case, and is trying to fit around the existing strength of these songs. And we know that the best musicals are born out of this collaborative process where the two are able to work in tandem. That's not to say they have to be written at exactly the same time, but they ought to be able to compromise with each other. And this is a script that so often shies away from the things that it really ought to be telling us. There's a scene between Martha Percy and Anne Vaux in which Anne is about to reveal something to Martha, and so Martha says something to the extent of, "What is it? You can tell me what's been going on." And then we just have this sort of fade down moment, and then they fade back up in the same spot, and she's told her. And there's no scene transition there. No one has entered the scene or left. Exactly the same people are on stage. I think we have like a little bit of a musical moment just to suggest that time has passed for a split second, and then it's happened and that conversation has already passed. And what that tells me is that as a writer, you just didn't want to write that conversation, or you couldn't find a succinct enough way to explain that conversation. And perhaps the instinct there was the audience already knows that this has been going on. The audience has this dramatic irony here where we know more about the situation than Martha does. But that doesn't mean there isn't still something to gain dramatically from Martha's friend Anne explaining to her, and us seeing the immediate reaction that Martha has to finding out that her husband has been doing this behind her back. Certainly it would keep us more intrigued than fading out on that scene and fading back in after they've had a difficult conversation. I would much rather see the meat of their difficult exchange than the niceties that bookend it. But those scenes at least have a clarity, and we can understand what it is that the characters are actually saying. The biggest problems still are these poetic interludes, delivered now by ghost narrator Guy Fawkes. And the worst, unfortunately with poor timing, is the very final moment of the show. Because, and spoiler alert here, as he is being burned at the stake, he is trying to impart something. And again, it's being delivered with such passion and gravitas that you know he really means it. But it's just so profound and inexact that you ultimately have no idea what he's talking about. And just personally, if I were being burned alive and was sharing literally my dying thoughts, I think clarity would probably be one of the most important qualities of that kind of a speech. I also have a very big issue with any show that tries to politicize their message but isn't brave enough to do it with any kind of specificity. There is a brief nod to people all around the country having a voting power, but it doesn't talk about the parallels between the government of the time and the government of now. There isn't any kind of legitimate call to action. I'm not saying it has to be specific. He doesn't have to decry the current Prime Minister or the current political party in government, even though that's what we're all thinking. But there could absolutely be more bravery in that final speech in admonishing the cruelties and the injustices that are perpetrated over oppressed people in this country. I think that's all you need to say, and even that, maybe that's what he was saying and I just didn't get it. But this is still a 3-star review. I think there is still more strength in this material, and I did say there are many improvements on last year's staging. So let me tell you what I did enjoy about this show. First and foremost, and although this puts the whole show in a little bit of a difficult perspective, I thought that Joe McFadden and Oscar Conan Murray were brilliant as King James and Robert Cecil. Now, they are presumably the antagonists of this show because we're meant to be rooting for the Catholic uprising. Joe McFadden begins with charm and then descends quickly into utter paranoia and madness. I like that he's become a darker version of this character now, and he less closely resembles King George III from Hamilton, because last time around it was a much sort of camper and more comic version of that characterization, and that was too close a similarity. There was a song about paperwork that, thank God, has been cut. That's one of the positive changes from last year. But Joe McFadden, though he is perhaps best known for his television work, is so naturally theatrical, and I thought gave a fantastic performance, second only to Oscar Conan Murray, who was playing Robert Cecil. Now, Oscar is this effortlessly funny performer who can get a huge laugh out of the tiniest reaction or the tiniest delay or just his facial expressions. He is so easily funny, but he's playing a character here who is not an exclusively comic one, and he gives us so much depth within that. In a show with a slightly confused tone, what he ends up resembling is a 90s Disney villain. He is very Judge Claude Frollo, and I loved that about him. And he's not doing full camp, but he's giving just enough camp that it works. I wanted him to have more material in this show because he emerges as one of the most compelling characters, which is all kinds of wrong within the context of this plot. And perhaps a big part of that was how wonderful Oscar's performance was. But he does get a very interesting Disney villain kind of a song. There is another that Joe McFadden sings in the second act when he is in the grips of paranoia, and I wish that Oscar's character Robert Cecil got to finish that song. There's a little bit of a dialogue break, and then Joe, I believe, sings again at the end. I wish that Oscar got to sing that part, just to kind of echo the idea of him having this control and him manipulating King James. After all, Robert is the one who convinces the king to reinstate legislation that persecutes the Catholics, which is the catalyst for this whole mess in the first place. Emily Louise Israel and Nicole Raquel Dennis give you beautiful vocals with their characters. Now, there's one particular plot point around this that I am going to spoil here. If you don't want to hear about this, skip ahead a few minutes. But one of my biggest gripes with the version of the show last year is the direction that these female characters take, because there is this moment in history where it's unknown as to what their response was, and so within the show the answer that they've created is that the women who knew that their husbands and the Catholic men in their lives were going to do this and didn't agree with it, they basically became the whistleblowers, and they wrote a letter warning the government about what was going to happen, dooming all of their husbands to persecution and death. This time around, we have lost several of those female characters, and we've only really retained the most necessary ones, which are Martha Percy and Anne Vaux. And in this version of the show, Martha has written this letter of her own accord. We find that out after it's happened, and after the world's most half-baked chase scene. The kind of thing you get when you arrive at the end of your plot and realise you have to tie it up with some sort of a bloody conclusion, but you have no idea how to write it, so you just have them lit dramatically and then shoot them after not saying anything. Another quick little note I will share is that after Martha is mourning the death of her husband via circumstances that were completely avoidable and totally her fault, she has this conversation with Anne where Anne is talking about the flame that she lit and how, like, her flame lit a flame in her husband and that lit the flame on the whole situation. And then Anna's like, but you can use that flame to light another flame. And she's like, I can't use that flame lit a flame in him, and then he lit a flame. And I'm like, dear God, just abandon this metaphor. This is too much. There's too many flames now. Like, I get it. I get that you like flames. And it works as a nice piece of imagery within the script for a few moments, but it's so heavily overused in that scene, I nearly yelled. Too many flames. Ditch the flame metaphor, please. I think there are other improvements you could make to this show structurally. We start to get a sense towards the beginning that Robert Catesby is this character who doesn't quite fit in with the rest of those around him, but we don't get nearly enough insight into that at the time. His criminality really ought to be foreshadowed much more strongly, and I would like to get more of a sense of his backstory towards the beginning as well. He reveals this in a song when they are right in the middle of all of their plans, but it feels as though the writing has arrived at that moment, suddenly realised that what would happen next wouldn't make sense without his backstory, and just revealed it spontaneously, rather than putting that at a well-crafted point in the show structurally. I do enjoy the set. Some of those doors were incredibly loud, like it's no wonder that the Catholics weren't able to hide well from persecution with doors that loud, but I thought the set looked fantastic. I thought it looked exactly how it needed to. It was dark, it was eerie, it looked period appropriate. It transformed enough to give us a variety of different locations. It was very effectively lit. That was Philip Whitcomb with the set and costume design, and that was Jason Taylor with the lighting. And listen, on balance though, I have definitely been critical of the show in this review, and I think the best version of this still has yet to take shape. It is significantly improved from that version that I saw last summer. That version was so tonally confused. The storytelling was all but absent. It is now emerging. It has a clearer sense of what it is, but it could also be said to be what I think is the worst thing that a musical can be, which is just a little bit dull. What it doesn't quite find in its score, and it definitely doesn't have in its plot, is that inspirational quality that something like Les Mis has. It doesn't have its own unique and fresh sense of identity and voice like Hamilton does. I think it really needs to do away with these poetic interludes. I think keep Guy Fawkes as a narrator character, but we have to explain the context of where he came from, and he needs to be able to communicate with the audience with much more clarity, because right now it is wasted time during which the audience disengages. And I think this is a show that has a choice to make, whether it wants its material to feel more authentically historical and be just that little bit more stirring and epic, or whether it wants to be contemporary and then has to absorb more of those qualities. But perhaps the most important thing is it really needs to prioritize the story that it wants to tell. What is the most important detail about that story? Whose story are you telling? Who are the characters that we are going to relate to here? Whose humanity emerges the most? Honestly, this show needs a dramaturg like flowers need sunshine. And a dramaturg's role within a show is to ask questions. The question that they would ask of this would be why? Why is it that you are telling this story? Why do you want to tell this story? What about this story speaks to you, and how best can you communicate that, whatever it is, to this audience? Why does this perspective matter? The answer cannot be to try and do something as successful as Hamilton, because that is not going to work. That's not authentic. It's not honest. What is it in this story that you are trying to tell? Convey that to me, and then everyone is going to have a better time. Those have been my thoughts about Treason. Apologies if you love this show. Apologies if you wrote this show. I do think it is getting there. It is just still far from what it could and should be. Like I said, if anyone else has seen this show recently, comment below with what your thoughts were, especially if you disagreed with me. If you loved this show, if you connected with it, tell me why. I would love to hear some positive accounts of this show. For now, thank you so much for watching my review. I hope that you have enjoyed. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel for many more reviews coming soon about all of your favourite West End and Broadway shows. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day. For 10 more seconds, I'm MickeyJoTheatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!